Hello everybody. This is part of the series on symbolic expressions, and today it's a special lecture on Teachers' Day, so happy Teachers' Day to everyone. And the topic is the teacher and society. So the basic point that I'm trying to convey today is that the role and status of teacher differs across societies and across history. So the topic is the teacher and society, changing contexts, changing roles. I will begin with some biographical stories about my own experience as a student and later as a teacher. So, in my earliest days as a child, I remember, and this is talking about more than 60 years, associated with teachers was that of fear and sometimes even dread about the teachers. Looking back, I sometimes can identify the reasons for the sense of anxiety that I had as a small child going to school. The reasons for my anxiety or dread, I feel, are sociological, are social, and cannot be seen as my own problem alone. They are dependent upon the social structure within which teachers, classroom, and students are located. For me, and I think it would be true for many like me, home was middle class, rooted in a regional context within India. School was English medium, privileged convent school. Put differently, my teachers did not look like my mother, dress like her, or even smell like her, and of course did not speak like her. I mention smell like her for little children. Very often home is associated with smells. The smell of your mother, the smell of home. Along with this unfamiliar nature of the school, there was a sense of punishment that maybe the teacher will punish you. And here, this is not my quote, this is Rabindranath Tagore's quote. He writes, when a child could not repeat his lesson, he was punished severely. The master, says Tagore, looked like a cane incarnate, looked like the cane itself, the stick. The textbooks of English that were common at that time and persisted for more than half a century made matters worse still. Again, that sense of punishment and the sense of unfamiliarity. English was an unfamiliar language for many people who then went to school. He then describes the school's rooms. He says they were cruelly dismal, the wall on guard like policemen. The house was like a pigeon-holed box rather than a human habitation. No decoration, no pictures, not a touch of color, not an attempt to abstract or attract the boy's heart. So there was a sense that it was an unattractive place, a gloomy place, a dismal place. That may have been true for his school. It wasn't true for many of the kinds of school that people like me went to. In my case, there was beauty and color all around that have left a lasting impression on me till today. But it was far removed from my familiar, at-home surroundings. One of the key reasons, and this is very important for teachers, students, classroom, one of the key reasons for this unfamiliarity, sense of alienness was language. Here, one has to take note of what exactly does language mean? Why is it so important? In my case, it could have been the sheer unfamiliarity with English. But for many others, it could be that the school language would be technically the mother tongue, but the mother would not be speaking it. So you would maybe speaking in a dialect at home, but in school there was a standardized mother tongue which would be used for communication and teaching purpose, and many often children, particularly from marginalized communities, would feel lost. Children, as we know, are born with an innate language faculty. From our everyday experience, we know that children, even before they start their schooling, internalize a complex rule-governed system called languages, and they have full linguistic capacities. They know how to use language. Even differently talented children who do not use spoken language but use other forms of linguistic communication also develop alternative complex sign and symbol system for expression and communication. Human beings are essentially communicative beings. We interact with others, we express the meanings of our life, we express joy, we express sorrow, we are creative with our linguistic expression. But language is more than that. In a school, in maybe even a college, in a classroom, language often is also represents power and hierarchy. Children have an innate ability, as we saw, but very often the language which is used is the language which is dominant, the language of power. In the university where I taught for many, almost 3 decades and more, the language of communication, of instruction was English. Those who came from non-English background found it difficult. Those who found English convenient and easy to speak found themselves comfortable. Here, this relationship of language therefore also relates questions of power and hierarchy. I now introduce two things: the state, or in other words, the government, and language. Some standardized languages in India, just like English had more clout in British period, some standardized languages in India have more power, have more clout. The state recognizes them. Those whose home language is a dialect, therefore, may not be at home even if the school language is the notified mother tongue. For the mother back home does not speak the mother tongue. Now, a teacher in a school, to be a good teacher, has to be one who not only knows her subject, whatever subject, it could be mathematics, it could be Hindi, it could be history, should be competent in that, but should also be aware where the students are coming from, what are their advantages, what are their disadvantages, or what we in sociology of education call cultural capital or social capital. Why am I bringing in categories like the state when we are speaking about teachers? After all, on Teachers' Day, when I am supposed to speak on teachers, very often in our country in particular, we eulogize. Eulogize meaning we say very nice things about teachers, that teachers are our gurus, teachers are people who know everything, teachers are people we should be obedient to. But that is precisely the point that I am not saying. I am saying the role of teachers and the role of students are different because in different societies and in different points of history. The state in a modern society has a very big role in education. In traditional society, education was to reproduce existing social structure. So, for example, in a caste society like India, education would reproduce caste inequalities. In a racist society like much of the global north, education would reproduce racial inequalities. In colonial India, education that the British introduced, like Macaulay, was not to make enlightened Indians, but to produce a kind of Indians who were obedient and subservient to the British state. So education in traditional societies, including colonized societies, was very often had the role of reproduction of inequalities. whereas in modern democratic societies, education is for the production of equal citizenship and democracy. Therefore, in any NCERT textbook for children, the first page is often the preamble of the Constitution, which talks about everybody's rights and that we should not discriminate on the basis of caste, class, race and gender. Again, to reiterate, education is not the same in all societies. Nature of education changes with different kinds of societies. So here is an image of teaching in traditional societies where the student is lying prostrate before the guru and is saying that the feet of the guru he will get even the dhul bhi chandan hai, that even the dust on the feet of the guru would be like sandalwood. Wood is something precious, that the guru is always right, the student is always in a position to learn from the guru. It is in a certain sense a one-way relationship, a hierarchical relationship. Education in other societies, not India, in medieval England was roughly the same. You can see people bending below, the teacher is sitting out on top and the students are below. The teacher is in a position to both educate and in a position of hierarchy, in a position of power, that same sense of fear and punishment. This does not mean that those teachers had nothing to give. Those teachers of traditional society were often very knowledgeable people and they imparted education of very high quality, but those education was often philosophical, theological, language based, and it was education which was more conveyed to convey what existed in society. This education was also very often restricted by class, caste and gender. So in the Western world, maybe the slaves did not access that education, maybe women did not access this education. In the contemporary period, in reality there may be discrimination, but there is no legal bar for anybody to be part of the educational system, because education here is operating in a somewhat democratic and equal society. But inequalities are very difficult to get rid of. So we had an unfortunate incident very recently about a young boy who was actually beaten to death because he drank water from a pot which was meant for the more privileged caste children to have. This is the persisting violence of inequalities in a classroom which ought to be equal, democratic and socially just. Now here we can notice then that there were intersectional hierarchies. What do we mean by intersectional hierarchies in medieval England? Meaning that the boys of a particular section of society could go to school, but the girls were not encouraged to go to school. If the girls were from wealthier family or part of the nobles, then they may have a chance, but not too much. The boys here would be tutored privately and would be taught by very famous scholars. While the girls were permitted into these schools, they had to be part of the families that started the schools. There were restrictions on girls' education. In other words, there was gender restriction. There was also class restriction, because privileged children of wealthy families had access to the best famous scholars who came home and taught, but the others were just socialized to learn the crafts that their father or their mother did. Similarly, in England, not only was class a question of barrier, but gender was. Young males and females could go to attend school, but only the girls who remained after a certain period of time were the ones who belonged to the upper class, as they were required to have a higher level of literacy. This is what I mean by intersectional class and gender hierarchy, that class and gender were intersectional in excluding some people from education. This kind of intersectional inequalities in education persist in India even today. As of 2021, India recorded a higher nationwide share of men with at least 10 years of schooling than that of women. Around half the male population aged between 15 and 49 stayed in school for at least 10 years compared to only 41% of their female counterparts. It is an improvement, but the point that I am trying to suggest is that for teachers to be aware of this social context is very important to understand where these students are coming from in the classroom. Gender education gap in contemporary India therefore remains. Only 1 out of 3 women in this region receive at least 10 years of schooling. Gender hierarchies in traditional West was very strong because the education system was run through the church, where most priests had strong opinions about men versus women and would claim that men were superior to women. The same story would be true in our context, whether it is the church, whether it could be a temple or an ashram or a madrasa, that very often traditional education would be gendered. I don't want to quote over here, but this is a quote from St. Thomas of Aquinas, where he's saying the woman is subject to man because she's weak by nature. This is an assumption which is very deep rooted. And in our own country, when the demand for women's education was raised by many social reformers in the 19th century, there was great resistance by the orthodoxy. This resistance continues till today. Very often people will say that they will encourage their children to study, but they will encourage their boy children to study more, because the girl child will finally get married and is only a guest for a few days. Now, the question of social structure and teacher education in contemporary India has to be emphasized. Abolition of untouchability is enshrined in the Article 17 of the Constitution, and yet we hear stories which are discriminating, like the story of the little boy, and this is not just one story which got more media coverage, but everyday humiliation, everyday segregation. We have stories where we have heard that little girls, very often from more discriminated castes, are asked to sweep the floors or maybe help clean the school, whereas the boys would not be asked to do the same. So stereotypical gender and caste occupations being reproduced in the classroom. Discrimination therefore takes many forms in the classroom. Segregation is one, that some people will be told to sit in one side, others will be told to sit on the other, some may be asked to sit on the ground, some may be asked to sit on the chairs. There would be name calling, abuse, preventing children from marginalized backgrounds from attaining leadership positions like class monitor or being forced to do manual labor, particularly jobs considered dirty such as cleaning toilets. Now, the important thing to realize is that all classrooms are not the same. So, in many private schools, such situations may not happen because there is general better well-being. But in many schools across the country, this happens. Very often, the teacher herself or the teacher himself has a lot of stereotypical and discriminatory ideas about certain communities or certain castes or gender. And it is important on Teachers' Day to realize that to be a good teacher, a just teacher, we must look into ourselves and say that are we being just to the students that we are teaching. So the point that I am trying to say is that these forms of discrimination changes in different kinds of contexts depending upon the location of the school. I have already mentioned the difference which would be most obvious between private schools which charge high fees and a lot of state schools which may not have even the basic infrastructure. I here present the photograph of Savitribai Phule, who was perhaps the first female teacher, and not only was she the first female teacher, she came from a marginalized community. And interestingly, she put forward in her school the principles of humanity, equality, liberty, justice. She was the first female teacher of the first women's school in India. She is a pioneering figure, and she fought against the dominant caste system and worked towards the upliftment of the marginalized. She demanded dignity for all women, and she, along with her husband, Jyotirao Phule, worked their entire lives to improve the conditions of education for women and for all sections and children of the dispossessed. Now here, so far, I have basically tried to show to you how education in traditional society was often education which reproduced the unequal structure of society. In modern societies committed to a democratic vision, education is to promote citizenship rights and social mobility, to train people to do better, to maybe become an engineer, to become a doctor, to move into the social ladder. It has a very different intention from education in a traditional society, which was basically restricted to only the privileged. Now, in the traditional system, the dominant mode of education is what is called the banking concept of education. And this is a legacy that we have to challenge. What is this banking concept of education? In the banking concept of education, knowledge is a gift bestowed by those who consider themselves knowledgeable and upon those whom they consider who know nothing. It is an unequal relationship like the picture that I shared just a while back, where you consider the feet, the sand of the feet of the guru to be also a gift that is part be given by the guru. This is the kind of education which is somehow alien in a modern context. I shall develop this further in the next lecture. Thank you.